5. Riddles in the Dark. When Bilbo opened his eyes, he wondered if he had, for it was just as dark as with them shut. No one was anywhere near him. Just imagine his fright. He could hear nothing, see nothing, and he could feel nothing except the stone of the floor. Very slowly he got up and groped about on all fours, till he touched the wall of the tunnel. But neither up nor down he find anything. Nothing at all, no sign of goblins, no sign of dwarves. His head was swimming, and he was far from certain even of the direction they had been going in when he had his fall. He guessed as well as he could, and crawled along for a good way, till suddenly his hand met what felt like a tiny ring of cold metal lying on the floor of the tunnel. It was a turning point in his career, but he did not know it. He put the ring in his pocket almost without thinking. Certainly it did not seem of any particular use at the moment. He did not go much further, but sat down on the cold floor and gave himself up to complete miserableness for a long while. He thought of himself frying bacon and eggs in his own kitchen at home, for he could feel inside that it was high time for some meal or other. But that only made him miserabler. He could not think what to do, nor could he think what had happened, or why he had been left behind, or why, if he had been left behind, the goblins had not caught him, or even why his head was so sore. The truth was, he had been lying quiet, out of sight and out of mind, in a very dark corner for a long while. After some time he felt for his pipe. It was not broken, and that was something. Then he felt for his pouch, and there was some tobacco in it, and that was something more. Then he felt for matches, and he could not find any at all, and that shattered his hopes completely. Just as well for him, as he agreed when he came to his senses. Goodness knows what the striking of matches and the smell of tobacco would have brought on him out of dark holes in that horrible place. Still, at the moment he felt very crushed. But in slapping all his pockets and feeling all round himself for matches, his hand came on the hilt of his little sword. The little dagger that he got from the trolls, that he had quite forgotten. Nor do the goblins seem to have noticed it, as he wore it inside his breeches. Now he drew it out. It shone pale and dim before his eyes. So it is an elvish blade too, he thought, and goblins are not very near, and yet not far enough. But somehow he was comforted. It was rather splendid to be wearing a blade made in Gondolin for the Goblin Wars, of which so many songs had sung. And also he had noticed that such weapons made a great impression on goblins that came upon them suddenly. Go back, he thought? No good at all. Go sideways? Impossible. Go forward? Only thing to do. On we go. So up he got, and trotted along with his little sword held in front of him, and one hand feeling the wall, and his heart all of a patter and a pitter. Now, certainly Bilbo was in what is called a tight place. But you must remember, it was not quite so tight for him as it would have been for me or for you. Hobbits are not quite like ordinary people. And after all, if their holes are nice, cheery places and properly aired, quite different from the tunnels of the goblin, still they are more used to tunneling than we are. And they do not easily lose their sense of direction underground, not when their heads have recovered from being bumped. Also, they can move very quietly and hide easily and recover wonderfully from falls and bruises, and they have a fond of wisdom and wise sayings that men have mostly never heard of or have forgotten long ago. I should not have liked to have been in Mr. Baggins's place all the same. The tunnel seemed to have no end. All he knew was that it was still going down pretty steadily and keeping in the same direction in spite of a twist and a turn or two. There were passages leading off to the side every now and then, as he knew by the glimmer of his sword, or could feel with his hand on the wall. Of these he took no notice, except to hurry past for fear of goblins or half-imagined dark things coming out of them. On and on he went, and down, and still he heard no sound of anything except the occasional whir of a bat by his ears, which startled him at first, till it became too frequent to bother about. I do not know how long he kept on like this, hating to go on, not daring to stop on, until he was tireder than tired. It seemed like all the way to tomorrow and over it to the days beyond. Suddenly, without any warning, he trotted splash into water. Ugh! It was icy cold. That pulled him up sharp and short. He did not know whether it was just a pool in the path, or the edge of an underground stream that crossed the passage, or the brink of a deep, dark subterranean lake. The sword was hardly shining at all. He stopped, and he could hear, when he listened hard, drops, drip, drip, dripping from an unseen roof into the water below. But there seemed no other sort of sound. So it is a pool or a lake, and not an underground river, he thought. Still he did not dare to wade out into the darkness. He could not swim. And he thought, too, of nasty, slimy things with big, bulging, blind eyes wriggling in the water. There are strange things living in the pools and lakes in the hearts of mountains. Fish whose father swam in, goodness only knows how many years ago, and never swam out again, while their eyes grew bigger and bigger and bigger from trying to see in the blackness. Also, there are other things more slimy than fish. Even in the tunnels and caves the goblins have made for themselves, there are other things living unbeknown to them that have sneaked in from outside to lie up in the dark. Some of these caves, too, go back in their beginnings to ages before the goblins, who only widened them and joined them with passages, and the original owners are still there, in odd corners, slinking and nosing about. Deep down here by the dark water lived old Gollum. I don't know where he came from, nor who or what he was. He was Gollum. As dark as darkness, except for two big round pale eyes. He had a boat, and he rowed about quite quietly on the lake. For lake it was, wide and deep and deadly cold. He paddled it with large feet dangling over the side, but never a ripple did he make. Not he. He was looking out of his pale lamp-like eyes for blind fish, which he grabbed with his long fingers as quick as anything. He liked meat, too. Goblin, he thought, good, when he could get it, but he took care they never found him out. He just throttled them from behind, if they ever came down alone anywhere near the edge of the water, while he was prowling about. They very seldom did, for they had a feeling that something unpleasant was lurking down there, down at the very roots of the mountain. They had come on the lake when they were tunneling down long ago, and they found they could go no further. So there their road ended in that direction, and there was no reason to go that way, unless the great goblin sent them. Sometimes he took a fancy for fish from the lake, and sometimes neither goblin nor fish came back. Actually, Gollum lived on a slimy island of rock in the middle of the lake. He was watching Bilbo now from the distance with his pale eyes like telescopes. Bilbo could not see him, but he was wondering a lot about Bilbo, for he could see that he was no goblin at all. Gollum got into his boat and shot off from the island, while Bilbo was sitting on the brink altogether flummoxed, and at the end of his way and his wits. Suddenly up came Gollum and whispered and hissed, "Bless us and splash us, my preciousness. I guess it's a choice feast. At least a tasty morsel I'd make us, Gollum." And when he said Gollum, he made a horrible swallowing noise in his throat. That is how he got his name, though he always called himself my precious. The hobbit jumped nearly out of his skin when the hiss came in his ears, and he suddenly saw the pale eyes sticking out at him. "Who are you?" he said, thrusting his dagger in front of him. "What is he, my precious?" whispered Gollum, who always spoke of himself through never having anyone else to speak to. This is what he had come to find out, for he was not really very hungry at the moment, only curious. Otherwise, he would have grabbed first and whispered afterwards. "I am Mr. Bilbo Baggins. I have lost the dwarves, and I have lost the wizard, and I don't know where I am, and I don't want to know if only I can get away." "What's he got in his hands, said Gollum, looking at the sword, which he did not quite like. "A sword, a blade which came out of Gondolin. Psst, said Gollum, and became quite polite. Perhaps ye sits here and chats with it a bitsy, my precious. It likes riddles, perhaps it does it? He was anxious to appear friendly, at any rate for the moment, and until he found out more about the sword and the hobbit, whether he was quite alone really, whether he was good to eat, and whether Gollum was really hungry. Riddles were all he could think of. Asking them, and sometimes guessing them, he had been the only game he had ever played with other funny creatures sitting in their holes in the long, long ago, before the goblins came, and he was cut off from his friends far under the mountains. Very well, said Bilbo, who was anxious to agree, until he found out more about the creature, whether he was quite alone, whether he was fierce or hungry, and whether he was a friend of the goblins. You ask first, he said, because he had not had time to think of a riddle. So Gollum hissed. What has roots as nobody sees, is taller than trees, up it goes, and yet never grows? Easy, said Bilbo. Mountain, I suppose. Does it guess easy? It must have a competition with us, my precious. If Precious asks and it doesn't answer, we eats it, my precious. If it asks us and we doesn't answer, we gives it a present, Gollum. All right, said Bilbo, not daring to disagree, and nearly bursting his brain to think of riddles that could save him from being eaten. 30 white horses on a red hill. First they champ, then they stamp, then they stand still. That was all he could think of to ask. The idea of eating was rather on his mind. It was rather an old one, too, and Gollum knew the answer as well as you do. Chestnuts, chestnuts, he is teeth, my precious, but we has only 6. Then he asked his second. Voiceless it cries, wingless flutters, toothless bites, mouthless mutters. Half a moment, cried Bilbo, who was still thinking uncomfortably about eating. Fortunately, he had once heard something rather like this before, and getting his wits back, he thought of the answer. Wind, of course, he said, and he was so pleased that he made up one on the spot. This'll puzzle the nasty little underground creature, he thought. An eye in a blue face saw an eye in a green face. That eye is like to this eye, said the first eye, but in low place, not in high place. Sss, said Gollum. He had been underground a long, long time and was forgetting this sort of thing. But just as Bilbo was beginning to wonder what Gollum's present would be like, Gollum brought up memories of ages and ages and ages before, when he lived with his grandfather in a hole in the bank by the river. Sss, my precious, he said, sun on the daisies, it means, it does. But these ordinary, above-ground, everyday sort of riddles were tiring for him. Also, they reminded him of days when he had been less lonely and sneaky and nasty, and that put him out of temper. What is more, they made him hungry. So this time he tried something a bit more difficult and more unpleasant. It cannot be seen, cannot be felt, cannot be heard, cannot be smelt. It lies behind stars and under hills, and empty holes it fills. It comes first and follows after, ends life, kills laughter. Unfortunately for Gollum, Bilbo had heard that sort of thing before, and the answer was all round him and any. Dark, he said, without even scratching his head or putting on his thinking cap. A box without hinges, key or lid, yet golden treasures inside is hid, he asked to gain time, until he could think of a really hard one. This, he thought, a dreadfully easy chestnut, though he had not asked it in the usual words, but it proved a nasty poser for Gollum. He hissed to himself, and still he did not answer. He whispered and spluttered. After some while Bilbo became impatient. Well, what is it? He said. The answer's not a kettle boiling over, as you seem to think from the noise you are making. Give us a chance. Let it give us a chance, my precious. Well, said Bilbo, after giving him a long chance, what about your present? But suddenly Gollum remembered thieving from nests long ago and sitting under the river bank, teaching his grandmother to suck. "Eggs," he hissed. "Eggs it is." Then he asked, "Alive, without breath, as cold as death, never thirsty, ever drinking, all in mail, never clinking." He also, in his turn, thought this was a dreadfully easy one, because he was always thinking of the answer. But he could not remember anything better at the moment. He was so flustered by the egg question. All the same, it was a poser for poor Bilbo, who never had anything to do with the water if he could help it. I imagine you know the answer, of course, or can guess it, as easy as winking, since you are sitting comfortably at home and have not the danger of being eaten to disturb your thinking. Bilbo sat and cleared his throat once or twice, but no answer came. After a while, Gollum began to hiss with pleasure to himself. "Is it nice, my precious? Is it juicy? Is it scrumptiously crunchable?" He began to peer at Bilbo out of the darkness. "Half a moment," said the hobbit, shivering. "I gave you a good long chance just now." "It must make haste, haste," said Gollum, beginning to climb out of his boat onto the shore to get at Bilbo. But when he put his long, webby foot in the water, a fish jumped out in a fright and fell on Bilbo's toes. "Oh," he said, "it is cold and clammy." And so he guessed. "Fish, fish," he cried, "it is fish." Gollum was dreadfully disappointed, but Bilbo asked another riddle as quick as ever he could, so that Gollum had to get back into his boat and think. "No legs lay on one leg, 2 legs sat near on 3 legs, 4 legs got some." It was not really the right time for this riddle, but Bilbo was in a hurry. Gollum might have had some trouble guessing it if he had asked it at another time. As it was, talking of fish, no legs was not so very difficult, and after that the rest was easy. "Fish on a little table, man at table sitting at a stool, the cat has the bones." That, of course, was the answer, and Gollum soon gave it. Then he thought the time had come to ask something hard and horrible. This is what he said. "This thing all things devours, birds, beasts, trees, flowers, gnaws iron, bites steel, grinds hard stones to meal, slays king, ruins town, and beats high mountain down." Poor Bilbo sat in the dark, thinking of all the horrible names of all the giants and ogres he had ever heard told of in tales, but not one of them had done all these things. He had a feeling that the answer was quite different and that he ought to know it, but he could not think of it. He began to get frightened, and that is bad for thinking. Gollum began to get out of the boat. He flapped into the water and paddled to the bank. Bilbo could see his eyes coming towards him. His tongue seemed to stick in his mouth. He wanted to shout out, "Give me more time, give me time!" But all that came out with a sudden squeal was, "Time, time!" Bilbo was saved by pure luck, for that, of course, was the answer. Gollum was disappointed once more, and now he was getting angry, and also tired of the game. It had made him very hungry indeed. This time he did not go back to the boat. He sat down in the dark by Bilbo. That made the hobbit most dreadfully uncomfortable and scattered his wits. "It's got to ask us a question, my precious. Yes, yes, yes. Just one more question to guess. Yes, yes," said Gollum. But Bilbo simply could not think of any question with that nasty, wet, cold thing sitting next to him and pawing and poking him. He scratched himself, he pinched himself, still he could not think of anything. Ask us, said Gollum. Bilbo pinched himself and slapped himself. He gripped on his little sword. He even felt in his pocket with his other hand. There he found the ring he had picked up in the passage and forgotten about. "What have I got in my pocket?" he said aloud. He was talking to himself, but Gollum thought it was a riddle, and he was frightfully upset. Not fair, he hissed. "It isn't fair, my precious, is it, to ask what it's got in its nasty little pocketses?" Bilbo, seeing what had happened and having nothing better to ask, stuck to his question. "What have I got in my pocket?" he said louder. "Sss," hissed Gollum. "It must give us 3 guesses, my precious, 3 guesses." "Very well, guess away," said Bilbo. "Hanses," said Gollum. "Wrong," said Bilbo, who had luckily just taken his hand out again. "Guess again." "Sss," said Gollum, more upset than ever. He thought of all the things he kept in his own pockets. Fish bones, goblin's teeth, wet shells, a bit of bat wing, a sharp stone to sharpen his fangs on, and other nasty things. He tried to think what other people kept in their pockets. "Knife," he said at last. "Wrong," said Bilbo, who had lost his some time ago. "Last guess." Now Gollum was in a much worse state than when Bilbo had asked him the egg question. He hissed and spluttered and rocked himself backwards and forwards and slapped his feet on the floor and wriggled and squirmed, but still he did not dare to waste his last guess. "Come on," said Bilbo, "I'm waiting." He tried to sound bold and cheerful, but he did not feel at all sure how the game was going to end, whether Gollum guessed right or not. "Time's up," he said. "String or nothing," shrieked Gollum, which was not quite fair, working in 2 guesses at once. "Both wrong," cried Bilbo, very much relieved, and he jumped at once to his feet, put his back to the nearest wall and held out his little sword. But funnily enough, he need not have been alarmed. For one thing, Gollum had learned long, long ago was never to cheat at the riddle game, which was a sacred one and of immense antiquity. Also, there was the sword. He simply sat and whispered. "What about the present?" asked Bilbo. Not that he cared very much. Still, he felt that he had won it pretty fairly and in a very difficult circumstance too. "Must we give it the thing, precious?" "Yes, we must. We must fetch it, precious, and give it the present we promised." So Gollum paddled back to his boat, and Bilbo thought he had heard the last of him. But he had not. The Hobbit was just thinking of going back up the passage, having had quite enough of Gollum and the dark water's edge, when he heard him wailing and squeaking away in the gloom. He was on his island, of which, of course, Bilbo knew nothing, scrabbling here and there, searching and seeking in vain, and turning out his pockets. "Where is it? Where is it?" Bilbo heard him squeaking. "Lost, lost, my precious, lost, lost. Bless us and splash us. We haven't the present we promised, and we haven't even got it for ourselves." Bilbo turned round and waited, wondering what it could be that the creature was making such a fuss about. This proved very fortunate afterwards, for Gollum came back and made a tremendous spluttering and whispering and croaking. And in the end Bilbo gathered that Gollum had had a ring, a wonderful, beautiful ring, a ring that he had been given for a birthday present ages and ages before, in old days when such rings were less uncommon. Sometimes he had it in his pocket. Usually he kept it in a little hole in the rock on his island. Sometimes he wore it when he was very, very hungry and tired of fish, and crept along dark passages looking for stray goblins. Then he might venture even into places where the torches were lit and made his eyes blink and smart. But he would be safe, oh yes, very nearly safe. For if you slipped that ring on your finger, you were invisible. Only in the sunlight could you be seen, and then only by your shadow, and that was a faint and shaky sort of shadow. I don't know how many times Gollum begged Bilbo's pardon. He kept on saying, "We are sorry, we didn't mean to cheat, we meant to give it our only present, if it won the competition." He often offered to catch Bilbo some nice juicy fish to eat as a consolation. Bilbo shuddered at the thought of it. "No, thank you," he said as politely as he could. He was thinking hard, and the idea came to him that Gollum must have dropped that ring sometime, and that he must have found it, and that he had that very ring in his pocket. But he had the wits not to tell Gollum. "Finding's keeping," he said to himself, and being in a very tight place, I dare say he was right. Anyway, the ring belonged to him now. "Never mind," he said. The ring would have been mine now if you had found it, so you would have lost it anyway, and I will let you off on one condition." "Yes, what is it? What does it wish us to do, my precious?" "Help me to get out of these places," said Bilbo. Now Gollum had to agree to this if he was not to cheat. He still very much wanted just to try what the stranger tasted like, but now he had to give up all idea of it. Still, there was the little sword, and the stranger was wide awake and on the lookout, not unsuspecting as Gollum liked to have the things which he attacked. So perhaps it was best after all. That is how Bilbo got to know that the tunnel ended at the water and went no further on the other side where the mountain wall was dark and solid. He also learned that he ought to have turned down one of the side passages to the right before he came to the bottom. But he could not follow Gollum's directions for finding it again on the way up, and he made the wretched creature come and show him the way. As they went along, up the tunnel together, Gollum flip-flapped by his side, Bilbo going very softly. He thought he would try the ring. He slipped it on his finger. "Where is it? Where is it gone to?" said Gollum at once, peering about with his long eyes. "Here I am, following behind," said Bilbo, slipping off the ring again, and feeling very pleased to have it and to find that it really did what Gollum said. Now on they went again, while Gollum counted the passages to left and right. 1 left, 1 right, 2 right, 3 right, 2 left, and so on. He began to get very shaky and afraid as they left the water further and further behind, but at last he stopped by a low opening on their left, going up. 6 right, 4 left. "Here's the passage," he whispered. "It must squeeze in and sneak down. We durstn't go with it, my precious. No, we durstn't, Gollum." So Bilbo slipped under the arch and said goodbye to the nasty, miserable creature, and very glad he was. He did not feel comfortable until he felt quite sure it was gone, and he had kept his head out in the main tunnel listening until the flip-flap of Gollum going back to his boat died away in the darkness. Then he went down the new passage. It was a low, narrow one, roughly made. It was all right for the Hobbit, except when he stubbed his toes in the dark on nasty jags in the floor. But it must have been a bit low for goblins. Perhaps it was not knowing that goblins are used to this sort of thing, and go along quite fast along, stooping low with their hands almost on the floor, that made Bilbo forget the danger of meeting them and hurry forward recklessly. Soon the passage began to go up again, and after a while it climbed steeply. That slowed him down. But at last, after some time, the slope stopped, the passage turned a corner and dipped down again, and at the bottom of a short incline he saw filtering round another corner a glimmer of light. Not red light as of fire or lantern, but pale, ordinary, out-of-doors sort of light. Then he began to run. Scuttling along as fast as his little legs would carry him, he turned the corner and came suddenly right into an open place where the light, after all that time in the dark, seemed dazzlingly bright. Really, it was only a leak of sunshine in through a doorway, where a great door, a stone door, was left a little open. Bilbo blinked, and then he suddenly saw the goblins. Goblins in full armour with drawn swords, sitting just inside the door and watching it with wide eyes and the passage that led to it. They saw him sooner than he saw them, and with yells of delight they rushed upon him. Whether it was accident or presence of mind, I don't know. Accident, I think, because the Hobbit was not used yet to his new treasure. Anyway, he slipped the ring on his left hand, and the goblins stopped short. They could not see a sign of him. Then they yelled twice as loud as before, but not so delightedly. "Where is it?" they cried. "Go back up the passage," some shouted. "This way," some yelled. "That way," others yelled. "Look out for the door," bellowed the captain. Whistles blew, armour clashed, swords rattled. Goblins cursed and swore and ran hither and thither, falling over one another and getting very angry. There was a terrible outcry to do and disturbance. Bilbo was dreadfully frightened, but he had the sense to understand what had happened and to sneak behind a big barrel which held drink for the goblin guards, and so get out of the way and avoid being bumped into, trampled to death, or caught by feel. "I must get to the door, I must get to the door," he kept on saying to himself, but it was a long time before he ventured to try. Then it was like a horrible game of blind man's buff. The place was full of goblins running about, and the poor little hobbit dodged this way and that, was knocked over by a goblin who could not make out what he had bumped into, scrambled away on all fours, slipped between the legs of the captain just in time, got up and ran for the door. It was still ajar, but a goblin had pushed it nearly to. Bilbo struggled, but he could not move it. He tried to squeeze through the crack. He squeezed, and he stuck. It was awful. His buttons had got wedged on the edge of the door and the door post. He could see outside into the open air. There were a few steps running down into a narrow valley between tall mountains. The sun came out from behind a cloud and shone bright on the outside of the door, but he could not get through. Suddenly, one of the goblins inside shouted, "There's a shadow by the door! Something is outside!" Bilbo's heart jumped into his mouth. He gave a terrific squirm. Buttons burst off in all directions. He was through, with a torn coat and waistcoat, leaping down the steps like a goat, while bewildering goblins were still picking up his nice brass buttons on the doorstep. Of course, they soon came down after him, hooting and hallooing, and hunting among the trees. But they don't like the sun. It makes their legs wobble and their heads giddy. They could not find Bilbo with the ring on, slipping in and out of the shadow of the trees, running quick and quiet, and keeping out of the sun. So soon they went back, grumbling and cursing, to guard the door. Bilbo had escaped.